My name is Claire Morrison, the man I share my bed with every night, the man whose heartbeat I've felt against my back, whose hands I've trusted to hold mine, is the same man who turned my parents into breathing corpses. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. From the outside, my life looks almost enviable. I own a small but thriving florist shop in our quiet suburban town. Daniel, my husband, works in construction management, often taking business trips that keep him away for days at a time. We have a modest but warm house with a garden I've poured my heart into. Neighbors smile when they see us together. To them, we're the picture of stability. But what they don't see are the visits I make every week to the long-term care facility on the edge of town. They don't see me sitting beside two motionless bodies, my parents Evelyn and Robert, their eyes open but empty, their chests rising and falling, only because machines keep them breathing. It's been 6 years since the accident. A rainy night, a highway, a phone call that split my life into before and after. The police called it a tragic hit and run the driver never found. My parents had been coming home from a charity dinner. Someone's reckless speed, someone's carelessness turned them into what they are now. I've built my life around that loss. Around guilt. Guilt that I wasn't with them. Guilt that I couldn't protect them. Daniel was my anchor through those first months. He held me when I sobbed until my voice was raw, whispered that we'd get through this, that I wasn't alone. He drove me to the facility every week, bought flowers for my mother's bedside table, even sat through long silences with me. Over time, my pain settled into a dull ache, like a bone that never healed right. I learned to live with it. I stopped expecting answers. The police told me there were no leads. Life moved on, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first crack appeared. I was in the shop's back room going through a dusty box of old personal papers. I'd been looking for a lease agreement when a thin folder slipped from the pile and hit the floor. The label read, "Traffic Collision Morrison Case." I froze. I didn't remember having any documents from the investigation. The police had handled everything. I picked it up, my hands suddenly clammy. Inside were a few printed forms, a diagram of the accident scene, and a single-page witness statement. The statement was dated the night of the crash. The witness claimed they saw a dark-colored pickup truck pulled over near the scene just minutes before sirens arrived. They'd noticed something about the rear bumper being damaged. The make and model matched Daniel's truck at the time. My stomach knotted. I told myself it was a coincidence. Daniel wasn't the only man in town with that kind of truck. Besides, I had been with him at home that night, hadn't I? Except, no. That night, he'd come home later than usual, muttering about a last-minute job inspection. He'd been damp from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. I remembered him peeling off his jacket and tossing it into the laundry without hanging it, unusual for him. I hadn't thought anything of it back then. I closed the folder and told myself to forget it. I had customers waiting. I had flowers to arrange. But the image of that statement followed me all day, whispering at the edges of my thoughts. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than expected. He leaned in the kitchen doorway, smiling in that easy way he had, asking about my day. I watched him as he talked, really watched him, the little twitch at the corner of his mouth, when he was thinking, the way his eyes flickered when I asked him about the year my parents' accident happened. "You mean 2017, right?" he said, casually leaning on the counter. But then he added something strange. "That was right before they started doing roadwork near the highway exit." I felt the chill in my bones, because the roadwork had started months before the accident, not after. It was such a small mistake, such a slip, but it lodged itself deep inside me. That night, lying beside him, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. The man beside me was warm, familiar, solid. The man beside me might have been the last face my parents saw before everything went dark. and for the first time since the accident, I didn't feel comfort in his presence. I felt a cold, creeping dread. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the unease. People misremember details all the time, especially when talking about something from years ago. But my mind wouldn't let go of that misplaced timeline, and the folder I'd found in the shop's back room felt like a pebble in my shoe, small, but impossible to ignore. When Daniel left for work, I pulled the folder out again. I studied the witness statement, trying to picture the scene. The name at the bottom was smudged, the signature almost illegible, but I could make out a first initial and last name, M. Henderson. It wasn't a name I recognized. The report noted the sighting of the pickup just minutes before emergency crews arrived. Driver appeared agitated, pacing near vehicle. Possibly male, medium build, wearing a dark jacket. Daniel had owned that exact model of pickup at the time. He'd sold it about a year later, saying we needed something more fuel efficient. I'd never questioned it. But now, a quiet thought curled in my chest like smoke. What if selling it had been about more than saving money? I decided to dig further. The police station kept public records on closed investigations. It wasn't difficult to request access. All I had to do was fill out a form and pay a small fee. They told me it would take a couple of days to pull the file. I thanked the clerk, keeping my voice even, my hands still, even though my pulse was pounding in my ears. That evening, Daniel was in a particularly good mood. He'd brought home takeout from my favorite Thai place, something he only did on rare occasions. "Thought you might need a little pick-me-up?" he said, kissing the top of my head. The gesture made me want to recoil. I hated that I felt that way, but every affectionate move now felt calculated, like he was rehearsing a role. My mind kept circling back to that rainy night 6 years ago. Had he been out there, headlights cutting through the storm, watching my parents die before disappearing into the dark? The next day, I took a slow walk to the long-term care facility where my parents lay in their silent world. The machines hummed quietly, filling the room with an artificial heartbeat. My mother's eyes tracked nothing. My father's chest rose and fell mechanically. I sat between them, holding a hand in each of mine. "Mom, Dad." My voice trembled. "If you can hear me, I think I know who did this to you. And I think I've been sleeping next to him every night." I half expected some flicker of response, a tightening of fingers, a shift in their eyes, but there was nothing. The only movement in the room came from the slow, steady drip of the IV lines. 2 days later, the police called. The case file was ready. I picked it up on my lunch break, bringing it back to the shop's office before opening the envelope. Inside were the full reports, accident reconstruction diagrams, photographs of the crash site, coroner's notes, and 2 additional witness statements I'd never seen before. One in particular made my throat go dry. It was from a man who had been driving behind a black SUV when the accident happened. He said the SUV had swerved to avoid the pickup, which had suddenly veered into my parents' lane. The pickup then sped away, running a red light just down the road. The partial license plate recorded matched the format of Daniel's old truck. The last 3 digits were blurred in the witness's memory, but the first 4 were the same. That night, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop my eyes from following every movement Daniel made. The way he opened a beer, took a sip, and avoided meeting my gaze for more than a few seconds. I asked him casually, as if the thought had just popped into my head, if he remembered the night my parents had their accident. "Of course I do," he said, setting down his bottle. "I was home waiting for you. We were going to have dinner, but you called to say you were stuck at the shop late. Then the police called you." How could I forget? My skin prickled. That wasn't how I remembered it. He hadn't been home when I got the call. I'd been alone, frantically dialing him until he picked up an hour later. I almost said it, almost asked him why he was lying. But something in his eyes made me swallow the words. They were too still, too calculating. Instead, I began watching him in silence. Over the next week, I noticed patterns I'd never paid attention to before. How he avoided driving past the highway exit where the crash had happened. How he would tense barely but enough for me to see whenever I mentioned my parents. How he always insisted on taking his own car when we traveled, as if he didn't want me near his work truck. The more I saw, the more the puzzle pieces slid into place. And once they started fitting, I couldn't unsee the picture they made. One rainy Thursday evening, I tested him. I told him I'd been thinking about selling my car and getting a truck instead. He laughed, but it wasn't the easy laugh I remembered. "Why would you want one of those gas guzzlers I don't know?" I said lightly. "I always liked the old one you had, the black pickup." Remember that his smile froze for just a fraction of a second. That thing was falling apart. Barely made it through the last winter I had it. I tilted my head. "Strange. I thought it was in pretty good condition when you sold it." He stared at me for a beat too long before looking away. "Guess your memory's playing tricks on you." That night, lying beside him, I finally admitted to myself what my gut had been screaming for days. Daniel wasn't just part of my life's worst tragedy, he was the cause of it. And if he'd kept it hidden this long, then I needed to be just as careful in how I uncovered the rest of the truth. The next move would have to be mine. But one wrong step, and I wouldn't just lose the chance to prove what he'd done, I might lose far more than that. The following morning, I woke before Daniel. I lay still for a moment, listening to his slow, even breathing. There was a time when that sound had comforted me, a steady rhythm that meant safety. Now it sounded like the breathing of a stranger, someone whose life I had shared without knowing who he truly was. When his alarm went off, he stretched, kissed my forehead, and headed to the shower. I forced a sleepy smile, then waited until the water began running before slipping out of bed. My plan was simple: check the garage. Daniel was meticulous about locking it, but he'd left his keys on the dresser last night. I patted down the hall, every creak of the floorboards amplified in my ears. In the garage, the air smelled faintly of oil and something else metallic, sharp, almost like rust. I scanned the shelves and cabinets, noting how organized everything was. He'd always been careful about his tools, but the top shelf of the far cabinet caught my eye. There was a small dented metal box pushed toward the back. Standing on tiptoe, I reached for it. My hands shook as I set it down on the workbench and flipped the latch. Inside were a few odds and ends: a faded baseball cap, a pair of leather gloves, and a plastic bag containing something that made my breath catch. It was a license plate bent, scratched, with the first four numbers matching those from the police report. I stared at it, my heart hammering so hard it made my vision blur. Why would he keep this? If the truck had been sold, why hide the plate instead of disposing of it? The water upstairs shut off. Panic jolted through me. I shoved the items back into the box, returned it to the shelf, and closed the cabinet. My hands were clammy as I darted back into the house, slipping the keys onto the dresser, just as Daniel stepped out of the bathroom, steam billowing behind him. "Coffee?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Sure," he said, running a towel over his hair. "You're up early. I've got a delivery to prepare." That day at the shop, I couldn't focus. Every arrangement I made felt clumsy, every bouquet wrong. My assistant Mia noticed. "You okay?" she asked, pausing beside me as I fumbled with a ribbon. I looked up at her. Sweet 22, the kind of person who believed the best about everyone. I envied her for it. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep much." She gave me a sympathetic smile before returning to the counter. I wanted to tell someone. Anyone. But the moment I imagined saying the words, "I think my husband tried to kill my parents," I knew how it would sound. That evening, I decided to dig deeper this time into his past movements. I waited until he was in the shower again, then took his laptop from the study. He had a password, but it was the same one he used for nearly everything our anniversary date. His browser history was clean, almost too clean. But I found something in the documents folder, a series of scanned receipts from years ago. One of them, dated the day before my parents' accident, showed a cash withdrawal of nearly $3,000 from a joint account. I'd never known about it. Another was a receipt for repairs from a mechanic's shop I didn't recognize, dated 4 days after the crash. The work order listed front-end damage, headlight replacement, bumper repair. The name of the shop, Henderson's Auto, slammed into my brain. Henderson. The same last name as the witness on the police report. I wrote it down, then put everything back exactly as I'd found it. The next morning, after Daniel left for work, I called Henderson's Auto. The voice that answered was raspy, older. "This is Claire Morrison," I began cautiously. "I think you may have worked on my husband's truck several years ago. Black pickup, 2010 model. I'm trying to track its history." There was a pause on the line. "You're Daniel Morrison's wife?" the man asked slowly. "Yes." Another pause. Then a sigh. "Lady, I don't want to get involved. That was a long time ago." "I understand," I said quickly. "But it's about my parents. They were in an accident that week. Please. I just need to know if." "Yeah," he cut in. "I worked on it. It came in late at night. Cash payment. He didn't want an invoice. Told me to replace the bumper and headlights, no questions asked. Looked like he'd hit something hard. Didn't say what." My hand tightened around the phone. "Did you ever talk to the police?" "No. Wasn't my business. And well, let's just say he made it clear it'd be better if I didn't." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. The pieces were lining up too neatly now. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a slow, suffocating certainty. That evening, I found myself studying Daniel's face as he talked about work, about the new client he'd landed. He was smiling, confident, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who believed he was untouchable. And maybe he was for now. Later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, I slipped out of bed and went back to the garage. I took the license plate from the metal box and tucked it into a sealed envelope, along with the note I'd written for Detective Jameson. Private and urgent. Then I hid the envelope in the bottom drawer of my shop's desk. If Daniel noticed anything was missing, I'd know he'd been watching me as closely as I'd been watching him. But the real danger wasn't just in him finding out I suspected. It was in him realizing that I was beginning to act on it, and that I knew could change everything very, very quickly. The next morning, I opened the shop as usual, but my mind was already elsewhere. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until I could leave without drawing suspicion. Daniel thought I had a meeting with a supplier that afternoon, which wasn't entirely untrue. My supplier would be Detective Jameson, the man who had worked my parents' case all those years ago. I called his office first, expecting to leave a message, but to my surprise, he picked up. His voice was older now, roughened by time, but still carried the same clipped efficiency I remembered from brief interactions after the accident. "This is Jameson," he said. "Detective, I'm not sure if you remember me. Claire Morrison." "My parents?" "I remember," he interrupted. "Your folks' accident. Hard case, no closure. You still looking after them?" "Yes," I said softly. "And I've found something. I think we need to talk in person." There was a pause on the line before he replied. "My office. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." The drive there felt longer than it was. My palms were damp on the steering wheel. When I arrived, Jameson was waiting in a small, cluttered office in a quiet corner of the precinct. His hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped slightly, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He gestured for me to sit. "You've got something for me?" I slid the envelope across the desk. "I found this in my husband's garage. It matches the witness description from the report. And there's more. A mechanic confirmed he worked on Daniel's truck right after the accident. Cash payment. No invoice." Jameson took the plate out, studying it for a long moment. "I always suspected your husband," he said finally. The words punched the air from my lungs. "You suspected off the record," he said. "We didn't have enough." The witness, Henderson, gave a statement about a black pickup with partial plates, but a week later he retracted it. Said he must have been mistaken. I didn't believe him. I think someone got to him. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Because I couldn't prove it, and telling you would have put you in danger, Jameson said bluntly. If your husband was involved, he's not the type to leave loose ends. I leaned back, trying to absorb it all. I need to know why. Why would he want to hurt them? Jameson hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thin, worn file. I shouldn't show you this, but your father was a witness in another case. Organized crime, illegal shipments coming through the docks. He'd been cooperating quietly with us for months. If word got out, the implication hit me hard. Daniel knew about it. I don't know how much he knew, Jameson said, but your father's testimony would have implicated some dangerous people. It's possible someone paid your husband to make the problem disappear. Or maybe he was already involved. I left the station feeling both sick and furious. The idea that my father's trust in the wrong person, my husband, could have led to him lying in that hospital bed for years was almost too much to process. When I got back to the shop, Mia was arranging fresh tulips. "Supplier meeting go okay?" she asked. I nodded mechanically, then retreated to my office, shutting the door. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Dinner tonight. That Italian place you like." I stared at it. He was charming as ever, completely unaware that every mask he wore in front of me was starting to crack. That evening, over candlelight and pasta, he talked about a promotion one of his colleagues had gotten. I smiled and laughed at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying Jameson's words, picturing that gasping pause when the mechanic recognized my name. Daniel reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've been quiet tonight." "Just tired," I said, taking a sip of wine. "The shop's been busy." His eyes searched mine as if he was trying to gauge something deeper. I made sure he found nothing. When we got home, I excused myself early, claiming I had orders to prepare for the morning. Instead, I sat in the study, staring at the darkened window, thinking about my next move. I couldn't rush. Jameson was right. If Daniel realized I was onto him, the danger would multiply. I needed more proof. Proof that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Proof that would make even Daniel's most convincing lies crumble. And to get that proof, I'd have to go back to where it all started. The next day, I called the hospital where my parents had been treated immediately after the crash. I told them I was updating family medical records and asked if I could access any non-medical evidence from that night: security footage, visitor logs, anything. Most of it was long gone, but the woman on the phone said something that caught my attention. "We still have the intake notes," she said. "From the ER staff. There's a record of a man who came in asking about their condition just hours after they were admitted. Said he was a family friend. The description..." She hesitated. "It matches your husband." By the time I hung up, my hands were trembling again. Why would he go there that night before telling me? Why pretend he hadn't been? Piece by piece, the puzzle was assembling itself. And the picture it formed was one I could never unsee. I looked at the clock. I had 2 hours before Daniel would be home. 2 hours to decide whether to keep pulling at the thread or to confront him and risk everything unraveling right now. I already knew my choice. That night, I decided to start small, subtle enough that Daniel wouldn't notice, but deliberate enough for me to observe his reactions. Over dinner, I brought up my parents. Not in a confrontational way, just a wistful comment about how much I miss the way things used to be. "I still remember the night it happened," I said, pushing my fork through my salad. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever really knew the whole story." Daniel didn't look up from cutting his steak. "It was a car accident, Claire. No mystery to it. I mean, the police never found who hit them." I pressed, keeping my tone casual. "It's strange, isn't it? You'd think someone would have seen something that night." He shrugged, but his knife paused mid-slice. "People forget things. Or maybe they didn't want to get involved." It was a throwaway line to anyone else, but I caught the way his eyes flicked toward me, sharp, assessing before settling back into that neutral mask. The next morning, I took my experiment a step further. I left the police report I'd found on the kitchen counter, half buried under the day's mail. Daniel came down for coffee, flipping through the envelopes absent-mindedly, and froze when his eyes landed on the paper. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. "Oh, that I was cleaning the shop office and found it in a box of old papers," I said lightly. "Funny, isn't it? Seeing something from back then." He scanned the page, his thumb running along the witness statement. "Why keep something like this around? I don't know. Maybe I'm just sentimental." I smiled, pretending not to notice how tightly he was gripping the edge of the report. A moment later, he slid it back onto the counter and changed the subject entirely, asking if I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. But his coffee sat untouched, cooling as he busied himself with other things. That reaction told me more than any words could. A few days later, I arranged to accidentally bump into an old friend of my father's, Gerald, who had worked with him at the docks. I invited him to the shop under the pretense of buying flowers for his wife's birthday. Over tea in the back room, I asked, "Do you remember anything unusual before my parents' accident?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "Claire, you know I liked your dad. But he was mixed up in some risky business near the end. He was trying to do the right thing, but not everyone was happy about it. Not everyone," I pressed. "Let's just say there were people who wanted him to keep quiet. And if Daniel knew what your dad was doing..." Gerald trailed off, meeting my eyes with an unspoken warning. That night, as Daniel read in bed, I leaned against the doorway. "You never told me you went to the hospital the night my parents were brought in." He looked up, his expression perfectly blank. "Why would I have? The intake nurse remembered you. Said you called yourself a family friend?" He gave a short laugh. "Small towns. Everyone thinks they remember something. I probably went to see if there was anything I could do to help. You were a mess, Claire." Maybe it was true. But his voice carried an undercurrent, something defensive, like a door being slammed shut before I could peek inside. The next day, I received another shock. A plain envelope was slipped under the shop's front door before opening hours. Inside was a single sentence typed in block letters: "Ask your husband about the night of June 14th. No signature, no return address. My stomach turned. This wasn't just my suspicion anymore. Someone else knew, and they wanted me to confront him. I burned the envelope in the sink before Daniel could see it, but the words etched themselves into my mind. That evening, as we sat in the living room, I brought up the date casually. "You know what I realized today?" I said, flipping through a magazine. "June 14th was the night of the accident. Hard to believe it's been so many years." Daniel didn't look at me. "Yeah. I was thinking of making it a tradition to visit Mom and Dad that day. Every year," I added. "Kind of like a memorial. Maybe even retrace the route they took that night." That got his attention. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would you do that?" "To feel closer to them," I said softly. "To remember." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should let the past be the past, Claire. It's not healthy to dwell." His insistence only deepened my resolve. I decided my next move would be bolder. I called the retired mechanic Jameson had mentioned a man named Carl Henson and asked if I could visit him. He lived 2 towns over in a small bungalow with a sagging porch. When I arrived, Carl was cautious at first, but once I told him who I was, his expression shifted. "Yeah, I remember that truck," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Black pickup, front end smashed in. Owner paid me in cash, told me not to keep any records." I didn't ask questions back then, but I remember his face. "It's your husband." The confirmation hit me like a hammer. Driving home, I replayed Carl's words over and over. There was no mistaking it now. Daniel's connection to the accident wasn't coincidence. When I walked through the front door, Daniel was at the kitchen table sorting through paperwork. "How was your day?" he asked without looking up. I set down my bag and smiled faintly. "Productive. Learned a lot." He glanced at me, then his eyes flicking across my face like he was searching for something. I made sure to give him nothing. But inside, I was already planning my next step, and I knew I was getting dangerously close to the truth. The night after visiting Carl, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces pale and unmoving in those hospital beds, and then Daniel's hands gripping the steering wheel of a black pickup. By morning, my mind had sharpened into something cold and methodical. The more I learned, the more dangerous my position became. I had to act as though nothing was wrong while finding a way to collect irrefutable proof. I started with the bank. My parents' accident happened in 2012, long before I had access to Daniel's old accounts. But a florist's perk is that people underestimate you. I stopped by our local branch with a tin of cookies for the tellers, smiling warmly as I chatted about neighborhood gossip. Then, as if it were an afterthought, I asked if I could review some old statements for a tax reconciliation. It took a little charm and a lot of patience, but by the time I left, I had a manila envelope containing photocopies of Daniel's checking account for the first half of 2012. When I got home, I locked the shop door, spread the pages across my desk, and went line by line. Most entries were mundane grocery stores, gas stations, utility bills. And then I saw it. June 13, 2012, cash withdrawal, $5,000. No corresponding deposit. No record of where it went. Just gone. My stomach knotted. Carl had been paid in cash to fix the truck. Daniel had withdrawn cash the day before the accident. It wasn't proof in a court's eyes, but it was another brick in the wall I was building. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I started watching him more closely. Daniel was careful, but he had habits ones I could exploit. For example, he always took important phone calls in the study with the door half closed, leaning against the desk like a man who owned the world. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the hall, I heard his voice lower than usual, urgent. "Can't believe you're bringing this up now. We agreed it was buried." "Yeah. All these years and she never." He stopped suddenly like he'd heard something. I froze, holding a towel mid-fold. My pulse roared in my ears. He resumed, quieter this time. "Look, I've kept my end. You do the same." That night never happened, understood. When he came out of the study, I was at the sink rinsing a coffee mug. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. "Just work stuff," he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Nothing important." I smiled, but inside the pieces were rearranging themselves into something ugly and undeniable. He wasn't just hiding from me, he was protecting someone else who knew the truth. The following weekend, I visited my parents alone. The nursing home smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Machines beeped softly beside their beds. I held my mother's limp hand, tracing the lines in her skin, and whispered, "I'm getting closer. I promise you I'll finish this." It was both a vow and a warning, not to them but to myself. That night, Daniel surprised me with takeout from my favorite Thai place. "You've been working too hard," he said, setting the bags on the table. It should have been sweet, but as I watched him portion pad thai onto my plate, I realized how much of our marriage had been built on trust he'd weaponized to keep me blind. Over dinner, I steered the conversation toward nostalgia. "Remember when we first started dating, that road trip we took?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, we didn't have much money, but we made it work." I leaned forward. We drove past the turnoff where my parents had their accident. I remember thinking it was eerie. Daniel's fork paused midair. "I don't remember that." "That's funny," I said softly. "You mentioned it once before. Must have been a slip." His eyes met mine, searching, but I kept my expression light, as though it were nothing more than idle chatter. Later that week, I decided to test him again, more directly this time. "I've been thinking about filing to reopen the investigation," I told him over breakfast. "New technology, fresh eyes. Maybe they could find who did it." He nearly choked on his coffee. "Why would you dig that up after all this time?" "Because I want closure." Daniel shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Claire, these things, they never lead anywhere. You'll just hurt yourself reliving it." I let the conversation drop, but I'd gotten what I wanted. His fear was no longer subtle. It was right there in his voice. The next clue came from an unexpected source, our neighbor, Mrs. Kent. She'd been living across the street since before Daniel and I married, and she loved her gossip as much as her garden. I was trimming roses in the front yard when she wandered over, sun hat tilted against the glare. "You know," she began, "I always wondered why Daniel came home so late that night. I saw his truck pull in around midnight. He looked flustered." I hid my reaction. "You saw him plain as day. Didn't think much of it until I heard about your parents the next morning." Her words replayed in my head for hours. It was confirmation from yet another direction, independent, unprompted. By now the trail was hot enough that I could feel the heat on my back. But moving too fast would spook him. I needed him to feel safe enough to let his guard down, maybe even admit something without realizing he was being recorded. That night, I sat beside him on the couch, resting my head on his shoulder. "I had a dream about my parents," I murmured. "They were smiling at me." Daniel's arms stiffened around me. "Dreams are just dreams." Maybe I whispered, or maybe they're trying to tell me something. I felt his heartbeat quicken under my cheek, and that was when I knew I wasn't just circling the truth anymore. I was standing at its edge, ready to step in. By the time Monday rolled around, I had rehearsed the next step a dozen times in my head. If Daniel was the type to bury the truth for over a decade, then the people who helped him might be just as careful or just as tired of holding secrets. I started with a name I hadn't heard in years: Eddie Rowan. He'd run a small auto repair shop 2 towns over, the kind of place where old pickup trucks outnumbered sedans, and the air always smelled faintly of gasoline and coffee. Carl had mentioned him indirectly. Not the first time he's had bodywork done off the books, he'd said about Daniel. At the time, I'd been too rattled to press. But now Eddie's name sat like a key in my mind, waiting to be turned. I drove out on my lunch break, telling Daniel I had a flower delivery. The shop was still there, though the sign had faded and the paint on the garage doors peeled in long curls. Eddie himself was in the back, leaning over an engine. He was older now, hair more silver than black, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. I introduced myself, careful not to mention Daniel right away. "I'm looking into an old case, a car that might have been repaired here in June 2012. Black pickup, significant front-end damage." For a moment his gaze flickered. Then he shook his head. "That's a long time ago." "I know," I said gently, "but it was the night my parents were hit. They've been in a vegetative state ever since." Something softened in his expression. He glanced toward the open garage door where the sunlit road lay empty, then back at me. "You should leave this alone, lady. Please." I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know." He hesitated, then sighed. "I remember the truck. Came in after hours. Man paid me cash, said it was for a hunting accident. The damage didn't look like it came from hitting a deer. Hood was dented, grill busted, paint scuffed like it had hit something taller than an animal. I patched it up, no questions asked." I swallowed hard. "Do you remember the man?" Eddie's eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought he'd lie. But instead he said, "Yeah, I do. Your husband." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Driving back, I kept replaying that moment in my head, Eddie's voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if he'd been carrying that truth like a stone in his pocket for years. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I went home, brewed tea, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam curling upward until it disappeared. Daniel came in around 6, smelling faintly of motor oil and cologne. "You okay? You look tired." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." I watched him move around the kitchen, opening the fridge, checking his phone. The man I'd built a life with, the man who'd kissed me goodnight for 12 years, had carried the image of my parents' broken bodies in his memory, knowing he'd caused it. And somehow, he'd still looked me in the eyes every morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Eddie's voice, and then Carl's, and then Mrs. Kent's. Every piece fit too perfectly. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a near certainty. But I needed more than certainty. I needed something that could survive in court. The opportunity came 2 days later. Daniel left his phone on the counter while he went to shower. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I wasn't in the habit of invading his privacy, but this was different. Most messages were mundane, but one from an unsaved number stopped me. Cold. Reminder silence is everything. We all go down if this comes out. The timestamp was from just a week ago. Before I could scroll further, I heard the water shut off. I put the phone back exactly where it had been and moved to the couch, flipping through a magazine like nothing had happened. That message told me two things. Someone else knew exactly what had happened. Daniel was still in contact with them. If I could figure out who that person was and get them talking, I might have the leverage I needed. I decided to test Daniel again, this time with bait. Over dinner, I mentioned casually, "I've been reading about cold cases. You'd be surprised how many get solved after 10 or 15 years. He set his fork down. "Why are you telling me this?" "No reason," I said lightly. "Just thought it was interesting." His jaw tightened and he changed the subject, but I'd seen the flicker in his eyes, a flash of calculation like a man recalculating an escape route. The next day, I made a call to a friend of my father's, a retired police officer named Jim Walsh. I didn't tell him everything, only that I had reason to believe new evidence might exist in my parents' case. "Claire," he said, "if you've got something solid, bring it in. Even a little thing could crack this wide open." I wasn't ready to hand it over yet. But knowing that door was open gave me a strange comfort. That night, Daniel seemed more watchful than usual. As we got ready for bed, he lingered by the dresser watching me brush my hair. "You've been distracted lately." I met his gaze in the mirror, just thinking about my parents. "Still, after all these years?" "Yes," I said evenly. "After all these years." For a moment I thought he'd say more, but instead he climbed into bed, turning away from me. I lay awake long after his breathing slowed the glow from the street lamp, casting faint bars of light across the room. And I made myself a promise I was going to end this. The next morning, I woke up with my mind set on one thing: following the money. Daniel had always been meticulous about his accounts, almost obsessive. Every bill paid on time, every credit card statement balanced to the cent. If there was any irregularity from the time of the accident, it might still be in the records if I could get to them. I waited until he left for work before pulling out the dusty banker's box from the back of the hall closet. Inside were years of tax returns, utility receipts, and bank statements. I spread them across the dining table, my fingers trembling as I leafed through the months around June 2012. It took nearly an hour before I found it. A line item highlighted in my memory, even though I'd never seen it before. June 13, 2012. Cash withdrawal. $9,500. That amount was unusual for us back then. We'd been saving for a down payment on the shop, and Daniel hated taking out more than a few hundred at a time. There was no note about what it was, for no matching deposit anywhere. Just gone. I stared at the date. The day before the accident. Eddie's voice replayed in my head. "Man paid me cash." I felt the first stirrings of nausea. I grabbed the next month's statement, looking for any follow-up. Nothing. No purchases that hinted at repairs or legitimate expenses. It was as if that money had simply evaporated or been handed over to keep someone quiet. That evening, I kept my face neutral as we ate dinner. Daniel talked about a client who wanted custom shelving for their garage. I nodded in the right places, but my mind was far from our kitchen table. Halfway through the meal, I set down my fork. "Do you remember when we bought the shop?" I asked. He glanced up. "Of course. We were so careful with our savings back then." I was thinking, wasn't there a time we had to pull out a big chunk of cash? I can't remember why. For a moment, his hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Probably for materials. Or maybe we were helping your parents with something." I tilted my head. I don't remember them needing that much." He shrugged too casually. It was years ago, Claire. Why are you bringing it up? Just curious, I said, smiling faintly. Old memories. But the stiffness in his shoulders told me I'd struck a nerve. The following day, I took the bank statement to Jim Walsh. This isn't proof, he said, adjusting his reading glasses, but it's suspicious as hell. $9,000 in cash the day before the accident. If you can tie it to repairs or hush money, that's big. Eddie said he was paid in cash to fix the truck. I just can't prove it was this cash. Jim leaned back. Then find a way to link them. Receipts, witnesses, anything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to press Eddie again. He might have kept some kind of record, even unofficially. When I showed up at his shop unannounced, he looked wary. Back again, I found proof of the cash withdrawal, I told him. If we can match it to the date you did the repairs. He shook his head. I didn't write an invoice. He insisted on no paperwork. I felt my hopes sink. But then Eddie frowned. Wait. I did jot down a parts order. Had to get a replacement grille and bumper. The supplier made me put something down for the file. Do you still have it? Maybe. Let me check. He disappeared into the back and returned with a dust-covered folder. Inside was a faded carbon copy, order date June 15, 2012. Customer ref Dan M. Paid cash. I stared at it. The day after my parents' accident. It wasn't ironclad proof, but it was close enough to burn. That night, I couldn't hide my mood. I sat in bed scrolling through my phone while Daniel showered. My heart pounded with every creak of the floorboards, every sound of running water. I wasn't sure what my endgame was yet. Going to the police with this now might push him into running or destroying more evidence. But holding on to it too long could be dangerous for me. I needed him to talk. And the only way he'd talk was if he thought I already knew everything. The next evening, I set the trap. After dinner, I casually dropped Eddie's name into conversation. Ran into an old mechanic today, I said, rinsing plates. Eddie Rowan. Remember him? Daniel froze mid-step. No, should I? He said he worked on a black pickup years ago, around the time of my parents' accident. The silence stretched. Then Daniel forced a laugh. Small town, lots of black pickups. I dried my hands and looked at him evenly. He remembered you. For a flicker of a second, something flashed in his eyes, fear quickly buried under irritation. You've been talking to people about me. I've been talking to people about my parents. I corrected. He didn't answer. He just grabbed his keys and walked out. When the door slammed, I exhaled shakily. It had worked. He was rattled. And a rattled man makes mistakes. I followed him at a distance, keeping my headlights off until I was sure he couldn't see me in the traffic. He drove to the far edge of town, pulling into a dimly lit lot behind an old bar. I parked around the corner and watched as another man approached his truck. They spoke briefly, the other man gesturing angrily before handing Daniel something, a small envelope. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. Something told me that envelope contained either money or the last thread tying him to the night my parents' lives ended. When he came home an hour later, he didn't mention where he'd been, and I didn't ask. I just lay awake that night, the envelope burned into my mind, knowing I was getting closer, dangerously close to the truth I had been seeking for 12 long years. 2 days passed, and the tension in our house became a living thing. Daniel was quieter than usual. His answers clipped his eyes, watchful. I could tell he was trying to gauge how much I knew. I made sure my behavior was perfectly balanced, enough normalcy to keep him guessing, but never enough warmth to put him at ease. On the third night, I was in the kitchen cleaning up after a late dinner. Daniel had gone into his home office, shutting the door behind him. Normally, he left it open. That alone was enough to prick at my suspicion. I moved softly, rinsing the last dish before slipping off my shoes. Barefoot, I padded toward the office. The sound of his voice came through faintly, low, urgent. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Then I heard them. It's been over a decade. You said there'd be nothing left to connect me to it. My breath caught. I edged closer. No, she doesn't have proof. Not yet. But she's asking questions, talking to people. If she finds out about the cash or the truck silence, then sharper. You said you handled the police. That's why I paid you in the first place. I stepped back, heart hammering. There it was, confirmation that he had paid someone off, someone connected to law enforcement. A floorboard creaked under me. Daniel's voice stopped abruptly. Yeah. I'll call you later, he said now, louder forced casualness dripping through. I hurried back to the kitchen, pretending to dry my hands as he emerged. His eyes flicked to my bare feet, and something in his gaze told me he was assessing whether I'd overheard. What are you doing? He asked. Cleaning up, I replied, my tone steady. He studied me a moment longer before muttering, going out for a drive, and grabbing his keys. The second the door closed, I ran to his office. His phone was gone, of course, but his desk still smelled faintly of his cologne. I pulled open drawers, rifled through papers. Nothing new. But on the far side of the desk, beneath a stack of old receipts, I found a torn corner of an envelope. On it, written in ballpoint, JW and a phone number. I stared at those initials. Jim Walsh. No, the handwriting wasn't his, and Jim was one of the few people I trusted. But JW could be anyone. When Daniel returned an hour later, he seemed calmer. Too calm. Like a man who had decided on a course of action. I needed to get ahead of him. The next morning, I called Jim Walsh and read him the number. He promised to look into it discreetly. By evening, he called back. Claire, he said, that number belongs to John Wilkins. Retired sergeant. He was on the force during your parents' case. Had a reputation for making problems disappear, if you know what I mean. Did he work the accident indirectly? He wasn't the lead investigator, but he had access to all the reports. If Daniel paid him, that could explain why certain leads were dropped. It was almost too much to process. My husband had likely bribed a police officer to bury evidence that could have tied him to the crash. That night, I sat across from Daniel at dinner, watching the way he buttered his bread as if nothing in our lives was amiss. How was your day? I asked. Fine. Talk to anyone interesting? He gave me a sideways glance. No more than usual. I smiled faintly. Funny. I feel like you've been talking to a lot of people lately. His knife scraped hard against the plate. You're imagining things. Am I? I asked softly. His gaze locked with mine for a beat too long before he pushed his chair back. I'm going to bed. I waited until I heard the shower running upstairs before taking his phone from the kitchen counter. He'd left it face down, charging. My hands shook as I keyed in the passcode, the same one he'd used for years. In his recent calls, I saw the number Jim had traced. I took a quick photo with my own phone, then opened his messages. Most were mundane, but buried in a thread with no saved contact. Name was a chilling exchange from 2 days ago, Daniel. She's asking questions again. Unknown. Shut her down. Daniel. If she digs up Eddie or the bank records, it's over. Unknown. Then make sure she doesn't. My stomach turned. I locked the phone and put it back before he came downstairs. The following day, I met Jim at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. I slid my phone across the table, showing him the messages. This is enough to get Wilkins pulled in for questioning, he said. If we can get him to talk, it could unravel everything. What about Daniel? Jim's expression hardened. If Wilkins turns on him, your husband's looking at serious charges. But Claire, what you need to be careful. If Daniel thinks you're cornering him, he might do something desperate. I knew Jim was right. But I also knew time wasn't on my side. Daniel had resources, contacts, and clearly no shortage of nerve. If he decided I was a threat, I had no illusions about what he was capable of. That night, as I lay beside him, I couldn't help but think of the title my life had unwillingly taken. The person who lies beside me every day is the one who destroyed my family. The warmth of his body under the blanket was a cruel mockery of intimacy. It was time to stop playing defense. The next step was going to be mine. I woke the next morning with my decision set in stone. If I wanted justice for my parents and safety for myself, I needed Daniel to confess in his own words. The police report, the mechanic's statement, the bank records, they were threads. I needed the whole rope strong enough to tie him down in court. That meant baiting him, but not too obviously. He had to feel in control even as I led him exactly where I wanted. I started with something simple. Over breakfast, I said I was thinking of visiting Mom and Dad today. Haven't been in a while. Daniel's spoon froze in midair. What for? They don't, you know. They're not aware. They're still my parents, I said evenly. I talked to them. And I've been reading about recovery cases. People waking up after years. He gave a dry laugh. That's not going to happen. Stranger things have. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not sadness, not pity. Fear. And then just as quickly it was gone. That afternoon, I called Jim from the shop. I'm going to push him, I told him. Make him think I know more than I do. Claire, be careful. If he feels cornered, he might. I know I cut in. That's why I'm keeping you updated. Jim exhaled slowly. All right. Just don't be alone with him somewhere isolated. When I came home, Daniel was in the garage tinkering with his car. I stood in the doorway watching him for a long moment. Was this the car you had when you met me? I asked casually. He didn't look up. No. Sold that years ago. I stepped closer. The blue one, right. The one you bought just before the accident. His wrench slipped, clanging against the floor. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. You've been asking a lot of questions lately. Just trying to remember, I said, letting a faint smile play on my lips. It was such a long time ago. Hard to piece it all together. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Maybe you should stop trying. That night, I placed a small voice recorder, the kind used for interviews, in my bedside drawer, battery fully charged. I'd keep it close, ready for the right moment. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I accidentally left the police report on the coffee table, half covered by a magazine. When Daniel came in from the garden, his gaze went straight to it. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. Where'd you get this? I found it in an old box at the shop, I said, keeping my tone mild. Funny how some things get lost over the years. Funny? He echoed, his voice tight. He tossed it back onto the table, but his knuckles were white. I was thinking, I continued. Maybe I should talk to that officer mentioned here. What was his name? Wilkins. Daniel froze. Slowly he turned to me. Why would you do that? Because I still don't understand how they called it an accident when there were signs it might not have been. His jaw clenched. Drop it, Claire. Or what? I asked softly. The air between us thickened. His eyes locked on mine, dark and unblinking. You don't want to know the answer to that. For a heartbeat, I thought he might actually say it, admit everything. But instead, he turned on his heel and walked upstairs. Later that night, when he came to bed, I kept my breathing slow and even pretending to sleep. I felt him lie down, the mattress dipping under his weight. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "You should have left it alone." The next morning, I bought a second recorder. One would stay in the bedroom. The other I'd carry in my bag. Over the next week, I began to plant seeds. Mentions of the accident, offhand comments about how strange certain details seemed. I could see the tension building in him, each interaction a small turn of the screw. Finally, I decided to push harder. One evening over dinner, I said I stopped by the mechanic's shop where you used to take your old truck. He remembered you. Daniel's fork paused midway to his mouth. So he remembered the damage it had right after the accident. Said it looked like you'd hit something hard. He set his fork down with deliberate care. You think you're clever, don't you? I think I want the truth. His lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. And what will you do with it, Claire? Run to your little friend Jim. Go to the police with your theories. They're not theories, I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like a predator sizing up prey. You think you know everything, but you don't know why. Why? What? Why it happened. Why your parents had to. He stopped himself, but it was too late. My pulse thundered. Finish it, I said. Why my parents had to. What? He shook his head, pushing back from the table. You don't want to know. Yes, I do, I said, my voice sharper now. He turned, heading for the stairs. When you're ready to hear the whole story, you'll come to me. And when you do... He looked over his shoulder. Don't pretend you're innocent in this. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. His words twisted in my mind. Don't pretend you're innocent. Was he trying to manipulate me, make me doubt myself? Or was there something about that night I truly didn't know? Either way, he was close to breaking. And when he did, I'd be ready to capture every word. The next morning, I called Laura Bennett, an old friend from school, who now worked as a criminal defense lawyer. I didn't tell her everything on the phone. Some things had to be said in person. We met at a quiet corner table in a downtown cafe. Laura listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. Claire, if what you're saying is true, this isn't just circumstantial. But to nail him, you need something indisputable. Something a jury can't ignore. I was hoping you could help me get it. She hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. You know, some files from old cases are sealed, right? Not public record, but... I still have contacts in the DA's office. If I make a request quietly, I might be able to pull certain evidence. You're looking for anything in particular? Yes, I said. Surveillance footage from the night of my parents' accident. There was a gas station just a block away from where it happened. I need to know if it caught anything. Laura nodded slowly. All right. Give me a few days. Those days dragged like years. Every time Daniel walked past me in the hallway, I felt his eyes on my back, measuring, weighing. At night, he'd lie beside me, too still, as if listening to whether I was asleep. On the fourth day, Laura called. I have something. You'll want to see it in person. Her office was small but private, the blinds drawn. She locked the door before opening her laptop. This was buried in the evidence list, she said, clicking a file. The grainy black and white footage filled the screen. It was dated June 14th, time-stamped 9:37 p.m. The gas station's camera faced the road. At first, it was just ordinary traffic, a couple of sedans, a truck. Then, at 9:39, a dark-colored car sped past so fast the image blurred. Laura froze the frame. My stomach dropped. The car was the same make and model as Daniel's at the time. Same distinctive dent in the rear bumper. We watched as less than 2 minutes later, flashing ambulance lights appeared in the background. I gripped the edge of the desk. That's him. Laura's eyes softened. Claire. This is strong. Combined with the mechanic's statement and the bank withdrawal, it's a pattern. But we need him to tie it all together himself. I nodded. I'll get it. That night, I placed one recorder under the couch cushions in the living room and kept the other in my pocket. I decided to stage the conversation around something that would make him defensive, make him talk. When Daniel came home, I was sitting at the dining table, the police report, and a still image from the footage laid out in front of me. What's this? He asked, his voice low. You tell me, I said. That's your car, isn't it? The night my parents' lives ended. He stared at the image for a long moment, then let out a cold laugh. You went digging. I had to. Because the man I share a bed with might be the one who destroyed my family. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the table. And what will you do with that little theory? Not a theory. Evidence. Something in him shifted then. His voice hardened, almost mocking. You think you're the first person to try and catch me? You think you're smarter than me. I think you've been lying for years, I said. But the truth has a way of coming out. Daniel leaned down, his face inches from mine. You don't understand. That night wasn't about your parents. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't go looking for them, but when I saw who it was, he stopped, eyes darting to the table. When you saw who it was? What, I pressed. His lips curled. Ask your father. Oh, wait. He gave a bitter laugh. You can't. My pulse pounded in my ears. So you admit you were there? His smile faded. You're not as clever as you think, Claire. Be careful what you wish for. Sometimes the truth will break you faster than the lie. He straightened, turning toward the kitchen. Dinner ready? He asked, as if nothing had happened. When he was out of the room, I exhaled shakily and retrieved the recorder from the couch. The audio was faint, but his voice was clear enough. It wasn't a full confession, not yet, but it was one step closer. Now I just had to push him over the edge. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside me, thinking about the half-admission I'd caught on tape. It wasn't enough, not for the police, not for a jury. He was careful, almost proud of how careful he'd been all these years. If I wanted to bring him down, I had to make him believe he was untouchable, just enough to make him slip. By morning, I had a plan. Step 1, lower his guard. I started acting as though our tense conversation had never happened. I asked about his work trips, cooked his favorite meals, even laughed at his tired jokes. The tension in his shoulders eased. His eyes softened when he looked at me again. He thought he'd re-established control, that his warning had worked, but every interaction was bait. Step 2, feed his ego. One evening over wine, I mentioned how I'd been thinking about closure. I told him I was tired of living in the past, tired of wondering. Maybe it's better not to know, I said, keeping my gaze just shy of his. He smirked. Exactly. The past only drags you down. I leaned closer as if seeking reassurance. I guess you're right. Still, I've always wondered what really happened that night. You've been my rock through all of it. I don't know how you do it, keep secrets so well. His eyes gleamed. It's not about keeping secrets, Claire. It's about knowing which truths people can handle. Step 3, set the trap. I invited him to a weekend getaway at a small cabin outside town, a place with no neighbors, surrounded by woods. I told him it was for us to reconnect. In reality, Laura had wired the cabin with discreet audio and video recorders. The first night, I made sure we drank just enough to loosen his tongue. I brought up my parents casually at first, telling him how much I missed them, how hard it had been without answers. Daniel poured himself another drink. His cheeks flushed. Answers are overrated, he said, staring into the glass. You get them, and suddenly you wish you didn't. I let the silence stretch before I asked softly, was it really an accident? He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw it. That flicker of pride, that hunger to be seen for what he truly was. They cut me off, he said, almost conversationally. Right there on the highway. Rain coming down, visibility crap. I pulled up alongside them, thinking I'd give them a scare. But your old man? He had a temper. Swerved toward me. That's when I nudged them back. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would drown him out. I thought they'd recover, he continued, but then they spun out. By the time I stopped, it was already too late. I saw their faces. Claire. And I realized who they were. He laughed low and bitter. That's when I decided to leave. Call it bad luck, call it fate, but in that moment I knew if anyone deserved it, it was them. My hands trembled under the table. Why, I asked. What did they ever do to you? His eyes hardened. You really don't know, do you? Your father ruined me before I even met you. Got me blacklisted from my first contracting job over some licensing crap. Said I was reckless, a liability. You think I forgot that? So you killed them? I whispered. I corrected the balance, he said. And I would have gotten away with it forever if you hadn't started poking around. He leaned back, grinning like he'd won something. But what he didn't know was that every word, every smug syllable was being captured in crystal clarity by the devices Laura had set up. This wasn't half admission anymore. This was a confession. a motive, an act, and no sign of remorse. The next morning, Daniel left early to check something on the truck. I used the time to text Laura with a single phrase: "We have him." When he returned, I was in the kitchen making breakfast, pretending nothing had changed. But in my mind, the clock was already ticking. The life we'd lived, the lie I'd been trapped in, was about to shatter. The drive back from the cabin felt strangely calm. Daniel hummed to the radio, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as if he had just secured some great victory. I sat in the passenger seat, keeping my eyes fixed on the passing trees so he wouldn't see the storm in my expression. The recording devices were safe in my bag, nestled between sweaters. I'd checked them twice that morning while he was outside, every file intact, every damning word stored and ready. All I had to do now was make sure he never suspected until it was too late. Laura met me 2 hours later in the parking lot of a grocery store across town. We kept our conversation short, our eyes scanning for anyone watching. "Tell me you got it," she said, barely moving her lips. I handed over the memory cards, my hand steady despite my racing pulse. He confessed. Motive and all, he's proud of it. Her eyes widened. "Claire, this is enough to put him away for the rest of his life." "Then let's make sure it happens," I said. By that evening, Laura had a friend in the police department quietly review the recordings. The detective, an old contact of hers from a past case, listened without a word, then leaned back, his face grim. "This isn't just reckless driving," he said. "It's intentional harm with clear motive. But he's smart. If we move too fast, he'll know and he might disappear." "What do you suggest?" Laura asked. "We build the case airtight. Witness statements, accident reconstruction, and this confession. But we need him to think he's still safe. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of pretending to love the man who destroyed my family." Daniel seemed almost buoyant those days, as though unburdened. He made plans for a summer trip, talked about renovating the deck, even joked about us finally putting the past behind us. At night, I would lie beside him, memorizing the sound of his breathing, not out of affection, but to burn it into my memory for the day when it would no longer be there. But paranoia has a way of sniffing out change. One evening, as I was folding laundry, Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a look that made my skin crawl. "You've been different lately," he said. I forced a light laugh. "Different? How? Calmer? Almost satisfied. Like you know something I don't." I met his gaze evenly. "Maybe I've just accepted things. Like you said, the past only drags you down." He studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good. Keep it that way." That night, I checked my phone in the bathroom, my heart pounding. Laura had texted 2 more days. It was almost over. The next afternoon, the detective called with instructions. "We're issuing the arrest warrant at dawn. He'll be taken in before he even finishes his coffee. I'll need you out of the house by then." Relief hit me like a wave, followed by a sharp edge of fear. Would Daniel sense it coming? Would he try to run, or worse, retaliate? I kept my distance from him that evening, claiming a headache. He didn't press, though. I caught him watching me from the kitchen as I walked upstairs. The final night felt endless. I lay awake counting the hours until sunrise. At 5:30 a.m., I slipped out of bed dressed quietly and took my bag. Daniel stirred but didn't wake. I drove to a small cafe 2 blocks from the station, my hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup I didn't drink from. My phone buzzed at 6:14 a.m., a single text from Laura. "It's done." Daniel was in handcuffs when they pulled him from the house. Neighbors peeked through curtains. The morning air was thick with whispers. He didn't resist, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, searched the street until they landed on me. For a moment, the calm veneer cracked. I saw it, the realization, the betrayal, the rage. "You," he mouthed, his voice drowned by the hum of the patrol car. The detective called me into the station later that day. "He's denying it now," he said, sliding a file across the table. "Claims the confession was just drunk talk, that he made it up to intimidate you." I smiled faintly. Then he's underestimating me again. Because the footage didn't just capture his words, it showed his face, his posture, the satisfaction in his tone. No one watching could believe it was a lie. As I left the station, the sun was setting, streaking the sky with a deep red. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my chest lift, not completely, but enough to breathe. Daniel was behind bars and the process of justice had begun. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Court battles, testimonies, and his inevitable attempts to discredit me still lay ahead. I wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one trapped. The pre-trial hearings began within a month. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, its narrow hallways echoing with footsteps and murmured conversations. I had walked through these halls before once for a probate matter after my parents' accident, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. Daniel sat at the defense table in a pressed suit, looking every bit the respectable contractor he'd pretended to be for years. His hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, and he even managed to flash a small, charming smile at the jury pool as they filed in. It was the same charm he'd used on me, once the same mask he'd worn to my parents' funeral. But his eyes, those told a different story. They never left me when I entered the courtroom. The prosecution's case was solid. They played the recording in full, the clear audio of Daniel's voice describing every detail of the night my parents' lives were destroyed. The words landed like blows, even though I'd heard them before. When the jury heard him say I corrected the balance, a ripple of discomfort swept across the room. The accident reconstruction expert followed, laying out diagrams that matched Daniel's account perfectly. Witnesses testified to his long-standing grudge against my father. Piece by piece, they built the image of a man who had planned vengeance and executed it without remorse. Daniel's attorney, however, was ruthless. In cross-examination, he painted me as an emotionally unstable widow, obsessed with reliving her parents' accident. He implied I'd manipulated Daniel into saying things he didn't mean, suggested that our marriage had been unraveling, and I'd been looking for a way out with a payday attached. It was a masterclass in twisting the knife. Then came Daniel's turn on the stand. He began softly, his tone measured, almost regretful. I loved Claire. I still do. But after years of her grief, her suspicion, she started seeing things that weren't there. I told her stories just to give her closure, to let her think she had answers. I didn't think she'd actually believe I did those things. The jury leaned in, some nodding faintly. He was good, too good. And the grudge against your father-in-law, the prosecutor asked. Daniel smiled faintly. We had disagreements, sure, but I respected him. The idea that I would harm him or anyone is ridiculous. I sat there, my nails biting into my palms, watching him weave a narrative where he was the noble, long-suffering husband, and I was the hysterical, vindictive wife. The worst part, I could see some jurors' expressions softening. Doubt was creeping in. That night, Laura and I sat in my kitchen poring over trial notes. She was furious. He's gaslighting the jury, Claire. If we don't counter this, they'll start to see him as the victim. I pressed my hands to my temples. We have the recording. Isn't that enough? Not when he's convincing them it was all a cruel joke, she said. We need something that destroys his credibility, something they can't explain away as just talk. It was the next morning when I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years, the storage unit. Daniel had kept it long before we married, claiming it was for work tools and seasonal equipment. I'd only been there once, and he'd been oddly protective, never letting me near certain boxes. If there was anything physical, any old records, receipts, even photos from that night, it might still be there. Laura didn't hesitate. If it's in your name too, we can get in without a warrant. If not, I'll call in a favor. We went that afternoon. The clerk barely looked up when Laura handed over the paperwork. The unit smelled of oil and dust. Tools hung neatly on one wall, but most of the space was taken up by heavy labeled boxes. We dug for an hour before we found it, an unmarked black case shoved behind a stack of tarps. Inside were car parts, all rusted from age, and one broken side mirror. It still had glass in the frame, and etched faintly in the corner was a number apart ID that, when run, matched the exact model my parents' sedan had collided with that night. Laura's voice shook when she said, "This is it, Claire. This is physical evidence he kept as a trophy." The prosecution's eyes lit up when they saw it. They had it entered into evidence the next day, and when it was presented in court, Daniel's mask slipped just for a second. A tightening of the jaw, a flash of panic in his eyes. The expert testified that the damage to the mirror was consistent with a sideswipe collision, and that the manufacturing date placed it in the same year Daniel had owned a truck, matching that make and model. The drunk talk defense crumbled. That afternoon, as the jury was dismissed for the day, Daniel looked over his shoulder at me. This time there was no charm, only the cold, flat hatred of a man who knew his control was slipping. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he murmured as the bailiff led him away. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I believed this would end the way it should. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. I sat in the corridor outside the courtroom with Laura, hands clasped in my lap, trying to read the muffled voices behind closed doors. Every tick of the clock felt like another step back into uncertainty. When the bailiff finally called us in, my knees felt unsteady. Daniel was already seated at the defense table, his expression unreadable, like a man determined to show nothing no matter what came next. His lawyer leaned toward him, murmuring something that made him smirk. The judge entered. We rose, and then the foreperson stood with a folded piece of paper in hand. On the charge of vehicular homicide, we find the defendant, Daniel Ross, guilty. The words seemed to ring in the air. My breath caught. On the charge of reckless endangerment resulting in grievous bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. Daniel's smirk vanished. His jaw clenched as the foreperson continued through the list. Guilty, guilty, guilty. When it was over, the judge thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the following week. Daniel's lawyer touched his arm, but Daniel jerked away, staring straight ahead. The bailiffs moved in to escort him out. As he passed me, he stopped just for a heartbeat. His eyes locked on mine, cold and sharp as broken glass. "You think this is over?" he said softly enough that only I could hear. "It never is." But I didn't flinch. "No, Daniel," I replied. "It is. For me." Outside, reporters swarmed their microphones like spears thrust forward. I said nothing. Laura steered me through the crowd and into her car, her hand warm on my shoulder. "That's it," she said once we were inside the door, shutting out the chaos. "You're free. Free." The word felt strange, almost weightless. For so long my life had been shaped by Daniel's shadow, his lies, his manipulations, the terrible truth about my parents. Now there was space where that darkness had been. The sentencing came a week later. Daniel received 35 years without the possibility of parole. The judge cited the lack of remorse, the deliberate nature of his actions, and the cruelty of keeping a memento from the crash. He didn't look at me when they led him away this time. In the weeks that followed, I began dismantling the remnants of our shared life. His clothes went to charity. His tools, the ones that hadn't been seized for evidence, I sold. I closed our joint accounts and took back my maiden name. Some mornings I'd wake with the old reflex, that heavy dread of the man lying next to me, before remembering I was alone in the bed. And then, slowly, the weight would lift. I visited my parents' graves on a clear spring afternoon. The grass was soft underfoot, the air carrying the scent of new blossoms. For years I'd stood here with questions I could never voice, with a hollow ache where closure should have been. Now I could speak to them plainly. "I know I told them. I know what happened. And he can't hurt anyone anymore." The wind rustled through the trees, gentle and constant. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was talking into an empty space. Laura and I remained close. She said the case had been one of the most satisfying of her career, not because of the conviction alone, but because she'd seen me change from someone who was surviving on instinct to someone who could stand her ground without flinching. One evening, over coffee, she asked, "What will you do now?" I thought about it. "Live," I said simply, without looking over my shoulder. Daniel's threat the day of the verdict still echoed in my mind sometimes, but I understood something now. It wasn't prophecy, it was desperation. Men like him thrived on believing they'd always have a hold over you. Taking that belief away was its own kind of justice, and as I walked out of my parents' cemetery that day, the sun warm on my face, I knew that was exactly what I'd done.